Why do we enjoy being scared? Could it be a remnant from our prehistoric days, where fear would have been the decider between fight or flight? Or is it a modern development compounded by a lingering Victorian fascination with the occult? It's a well-known fact that the Victorians were a cheerless bunch. Indeed, some of the darkest times of British history arose during the Victorian era, with Jack the Ripper being the most widely known abroad. But what you may not know is that during the 1800s, the prim and proper Victorians were fascinated with the odd and the unnatural. Penny Dreadfuls, the namesake of the unfortunately short-lived TV series, were particularly popular with the working class and are noteworthy for being the origin of the Sweeney Todd myth, as well as reinterpreting already infamous British figures like the highwayman Dick Turpin for a new, more refined audience. I bring this up, the Victorian era specifically, because it'd be foolish to dismiss it as a source of inspiration for today's game. Gothic fiction, or more specifically Gothic horror, pioneered the haunting, spire-filled landscape of much of modern horror. It introduced the trope of the huge abandoned or lifeless house, an ancient curse, the supernatural, the questioning of reality. With the resurgence in horror throughout the mid-1900s with B-movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, all the way to the genre-defining Night of the Living Dead and Alien, the human fascination with fear is one that has never really abated. You might notice that horror movies tend to come and go in waves, but they are arguably the most enduring genre of film, and you'll often see trends typically influenced by the most recently successful horror film. A great example of this is Paranormal Activity, a mediocre film that set the stage for a tirade of found footage films in its wake, along with films that professed a grounding in reality to maintain a believable paranormal aesthetic. In the 60s and 70s, The Walking Dead were all the rage. In the 80s, body horrors like The Thing cemented themselves into the annals of history, whilst the slasher genre also dominated the decade. The horror genre nosedived during the 90s, where the standout film tends to be the Blair Witch Project. And without resorting to search engines, I'm struggling to think of anything particularly well known from that decade. Many of those listed on IMDb seem to come with caveats. I wouldn't consider Seven to be a horror film, for example, although it does have its moments, and Tremors is about as frightening as my cat. Regardless, the past 18 years have seen a hitherto unknown surge in interest in the horror genre. It seems as if it has become trendy to want to buckle down in the cinema and watch a third-rate film, trying its best to scare you with loud and bombastic orchestral screeches and angry violins at every corner. From the Saw franchise to the aforementioned Paranormal Activity, The Conjuring and its expanded universe, Insidious. Right now we're sitting in the era of the franchise, and the horror genre is steadily becoming a game of box ticking. The fact of the matter is, whether we understand why or not, we like to be scared. The absurd popularity of Five Nights at Freddy's gave rise to what may as well be an entire subgenre that we will, at this point, call the jump scare palooza. Countless indie games created on a shoestring budget, or at times with no budget at all, swarmed the Steam storefront. Cobbled together from pre-made or occasionally stolen assets and thrown out for a pittance of a price, it was difficult to find the gems hidden amongst the masses, but when you uncovered them, you often found that their quality was astounding. Whilst it's true that the horror genre in gaming didn't begin in 1996, earlier efforts like Doom, and more appropriately Alone in the Dark, were either focused on something a little more important, like shooting demons, or are a little difficult to take seriously by today's standards. As someone who never played Alone in the Dark until a year or so ago, and whose first video game was Pokemon Blue, my introduction to horror was primarily through film. I saw Alien when I was still in single digits and loved every moment of it, and to this day I think this is what unearthed the horror seeker in me. So when the opportunity arose in the early 2000s to try my hand at my first ever horror game, I eagerly jumped at the chance to dig my claws into Resident Evil.
Wow, what a mansion! Stop it! Don't open that door!
No, not that one. My first horror game was the Resident Evil Remake, and to this day I still think this game looks absolutely gorgeous. This isn't even the HD remaster, this is the very original 2002 game. It holds up pretty well, and the biggest reason for this comes down to the decision to use pre-rendered backgrounds. These days, pre-rendered backgrounds are a lot less common, especially in big-budget AAA productions, but for the Resident Evil franchise this was Capcom's way of creating a deceptively large world that both looked and felt realistic, with branching pathways and shortcuts that felt satisfying to uncover. With exploration being the key factor in the player's enjoyment and immersion, the pre-rendered backgrounds allowed Capcom to focus fidelity on their characters, their combat, and their puzzles. Now, granted, these games do look laughable by today's standards, they certainly haven't aged very well, but that doesn't stop them from being some of the most intense experiences of the horror genre. And as a crazy collector who owns far too many copies of each of the games to even try to justify the obsession, you can be damn sure that they are well loved by at least one lunatic in the Northern Hemisphere. The Resident Evil that we know and love from 1996 was the brainchild of Shinji Mikami and Tokuro Fujiwara. Whilst simplistic when compared to later entries in the series, and especially when compared to a certain other survival horror franchise released 2 years later, Resident Evil was a phenomenal success even with the incredible dialogue, poor translation and glorious live-action intro video. Initially conceived as a remake of the 80s Japanese horror game Sweet Home, Resident Evil was tweaked and rearranged from the game that might have contained a cyborg companion and a black comic relief character into a super serious tale of blood, guts and betrayal. Despite its flawed execution, Resident Evil went on to become the best-selling Capcom debut. Still, despite its campy glamour and ugly presentation, Resident Evil is still fondly remembered for its atmosphere, its design, and more importantly, its mansion. So when the time came to remake it, Capcom made the bold and fantastic decision to not just remake the game, but rebuild it from the ground up. The mansion expanded, entirely new rooms, new puzzles and new enemies were added. Whole wings of the mansion were redesigned and rendered. Character interactions were increased and the story was hugely fleshed out. Background characters received more prominence and the soundtrack was entirely rewritten and recorded. Somehow, Capcom managed to transform a slightly silly comedy horror into a haunting, captivating survival horror escapade that to this day remains the most frightening, fully realised experience in the series' history. To fully understand what it is about the Resident Evil remake that makes it so memorable, we need to deconstruct the game in its entirety, starting with that beloved mansion. If you ask anyone who has played Resident Evil at least a few times, the chances are that they could recall the approximate layout of the mansion from memory. The mansion is designed to imprint itself upon your mind, to minimise the amount of time that the player has to spend in menus looking at the map. Indeed, if you take a look at a selection of areas from the mansion, a fan of the game could likely tell you their purpose or contents without much thought on the matter. Each room, each corridor, has a distinct look and feel to it. The dining room, your first port of call after the foyer, is cosy and inviting at first glance, a calming rush of warm colours and a blazing fire to soothe your nerves. Immediately this is juxtaposed against the succeeding hall, which is dark, dismal, swathed in shadows and the scene of your first zombie encounter. With its opening 10 minutes, Resident Evil successfully tricks the player into memorising the location and importance of these two areas with barely any effort, and without the player even noticing. In fact, mere moments afterwards, the game has you circumnavigate the foyer under the pretense of looking for Wesker, giving the player an opportunity to get a feel for how the game will progress. There's a door under the stairs that seems to need a specific item to open, and we'll remember that for later. It's so simple, but it's tremendously effective. And this is a sensation that isn't limited to the ground floor of the mansion. The mansion's layout and the positioning of the locked doors has been carefully crafted to guide the player around it, to ensure that you're always moving in the right direction and to minimise backtracking as much as possible. As you're exploring, you're making note of each locked door, each new area, remembering them as Richard's hallway, the dog balcony, the mirror hallway. In fact, there's barely any need to look at the map, and I would go so far as to say that it isn't particularly necessary unless you're not in the mood to try to recall exactly which door is the last one that requires the sword key. It wasn't until the HD re-release on the PS4 that I discovered how to get the map for the first floor, that's the second floor for any non-Europeans out there. I'd never bothered before because it never struck me as essential. The only area within the mansion proper that I would admit to never really caring about is the outdoor area with Forest's corpse, where you can pick up some herbs and, in Jill's campaign, the grenade launcher. There's nothing else of note here, so this has always struck me as the one area of the game that doesn't quite fit unless you're fully committed to 100% exploration. Having said that, it does have a fairly effective scare in the fact that if you wander all the way to the end of the balcony, partway through the game, you are also introduced to an outdoor area containing the gardens and the residence, where the carefully crafted atmosphere of the mansion is suddenly and violently brought to the fore. The residence is cramped, and its weighted atmosphere is tightly packed and oppressive. Moths buzz around the lights, the floorboards creak, and the player naturally avoids the suspicious gaps in the boards, perhaps even without realising. The more you explore, the more the emptiness increases your paranoia, culminating in a perfect moment of silence. Beneath the residence is the Aqua Ring, an area of such bleak, startling simplicity that it's difficult to believe that this is the same company that produced Resident Evil 6. The theme of Neptune is also frighteningly simple, a series of repeating notes that worm their way into your mind and echo long after you have left the monstrosities within behind. The final few areas of the game are evenly divided into token and memorable. There's the underground passageway, where in the original game you ran away from boulders and engaged in a hilariously acted sequence involving another STARS member, and in the remake you run away from boulders, engage in cutscenes and run the hell away from the game's greatest new addition. And the laboratories, which are something of a given but hardly antithetical to the game thus far. The labs are easily the least memorable area of the game, but that does not mean that they aren't laced with atmosphere as well. It's all clean and clinical, appropriately cold and nerve-wracking, and though it does involve one of the oddest and arguably tensest moments in the game, having to walk from the generator rooms with a volatile tank of explosive fuel in your inventory, it would be unfair to criticise the final area of the game for being less memorable, given that everything up to this point has been building up to the reveal of the atrocities that went on beneath Umbrella's cool facade. I will concede that the labs are my least favourite area of the game, but as the culmination of your efforts to uncover the mysteries of the Spencer Mansion, calling the final stretch of the game serviceable would be inconsiderate at best. It's a perfect finale to your valiant efforts, and sees you making the final few choices that will decide the fate of your comrades, the mansion, and Umbrella themselves. Of the vast improvements made to the remake, easily the most intriguing decision was to improve upon the already hideous collection of rotting monstrosities present within the original game. Resident Evil has always had a relatively diverse cast of creatures, from plain old zombies to scruffy mutts, mutated frogs, and worm monsters. And it is only in recent years that the series' stellar monster design has begun to stagnate. I would argue that the decline in interesting monsters began with Resident Evil 4 through no fault of its own. Since the game that followed attempted to compound upon the unexpected success of the fourth iteration, it did so by unflatteringly aping everything without much understanding of its lineage. As a result, we went from zombies and dogs, chimeras and sharks, humongous snakes and whatever the hell was going on in Resident Evil 3, to dudes with guns, big dudes with guns, and the occasional chimera and slimy tentacle monster thrown in for good measure. Prior to this, each game had brought something new to the table. Resident Evil 2 had its lickers, Zero had its Leechman, Nemesis had, Nemesis, and even Code Veronica had those infuriating Bandersnatch enemies. But with the advent of homogeneity that was Resident Evil 5, the series' identity slowly became lost in a quagmire of stale design and absurd plot developments. With all that in mind, it's easy to look back on Resident Evil and admire its impressive commitment to developing not just a new take on an old game, but a remake that felt like a fresh, brand new experience. Although all of the enemies from the original game returned, they were spruced up with some new, fascinating additions, and one of these editions was so terrifying to my young and impressionable self the first time I came across it that I had to stop playing. Trapped in a save room with barely a handful of bullets, I had come across my very first Crimson Head. In the original game, dead zombies stayed dead. In the Resident Evil remake, dead zombies that still have their heads intact and have not been burnt to cinders by grenade rounds or your trusty lighter and kerosene combo will eventually become Crimson Heads. Stronger, faster, far more deadly mutations easily distinguished by their talon-like fingers and deep red skin. They are far more mobile and agile than their predecessors, and avoiding them is difficult. They take more punishment, and the more zombies you kill, the more trouble you'll find yourself in. The criteria for a zombie becoming a Crimson Head is simple. If it's dead, and it has its head, then it will mutate either when a set amount of time has passed, or the player has completed a certain number of puzzles within the mansion. The latter is a superb way of taunting players who think they can outrun the timer by speedrunning the rest of the game before all of those undead they've slaughtered pick up their boots again. But the most fascinating addition to the game is what I would consider the pinnacle of the Resident Evil series storytelling. When you are first guided into exploring the mansion's foyer, you come across a locked gate under the stairs that, when you later examine it, produces a hideous, ghastly wail. Throughout the early game, you uncover hints of a sinister being known as Lisa inhabiting the mansion and its grounds. Death masks, photos of a happy family, and later on a diary that tells the whole sad tale of Lisa Trevor and her family. Lisa, a young girl brutally experimented on, is now a monstrous, hunched being who wears the skin of her mother. Lisa is not just a random addition, an extra monster for the sake of having something else in the game. She has a backstory, a fully realised presence, a purpose. Lisa is not just another creature stalking you. She has a tangible presence and she is a very real threat. She can't be killed until the point at which the game specifies that she must be. Because Lisa doesn't really want to eat your brains. She just wants her mother back. All things considered, the fact that Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine and Albert Wesker have become not just beloved characters in this franchise, but highly recognisable and, especially in Wesker's case, eminently quotable, is kind of amazing. These are characters who were introduced to the world with this video.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine.
And more importantly, with this voice acting.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. No! Don't go!
From the off, these characters were designed with archetypes in mind. Chris, the tough guy type, Jill, a strong, independent woman, Wesker, the stereotypical villainous lunatic. Each of them has a distinct colour theme: green for Chris, blue for Jill, black for Wesker, red for Barry. Each player character has their strengths and weaknesses. Chris can take more damage than Jill but has fewer inventory slots. He also constantly has the lighter to hand, so as not to waste a slot, unlike Jill. Jill, on the other hand, can hold more items and can pick any lock that she comes across, but is physically weaker than Chris. When it comes to personality, the blunt honesty is that Jill seems to have been given the largest slice of the personality pie. Her story feels far more fleshed out than Chris's, and though the essentials of the plot remain the same, Jill's interactions with Barry make the game far more interesting. Their dynamic is very familial. I would even suggest that Jill considers Barry something of a father figure, trusting his judgment above others and exercising respect and goodwill whenever they meet. Even after it is revealed that Barry is being manipulated by Wesker to hurry along the deaths of his teammates, Jill's forgiving nature and respect for him ensures that Barry does not blame himself for the events of the incident. One of the biggest reasons that I suspect a little more attention was given to fleshing out Jill's character is due to the extra attention given to her story. Barry and Jill's relationship is easily the most important part of her arc, and one that is not really mirrored by anything in Chris's campaign. It is very telling that in comparison to the original game, it is actually next to impossible for Barry to die in this version, with the only exception being a very clear-cut choice made during the Lisa fight. Like the original, Barry only appears in Jill's game, though given his appearance in Nemesis and Revelations 2, his survival is obviously canonical. Similarly, Rebecca only appears in Chris's campaign, although unlike Barry, who essentially unlocks super easy mode if you're struggling as Jill, Rebecca is considerably less integral to Chris's story. She's at the mansion due to the events of Resident Evil 0, and Chris stumbles across her when he finds Richard bitten by
terrible demons. Ouch!
Thanks, Richard. That isn't to say that Rebecca is utterly useless. To the contrary, she does provide some much-needed assistance for Chris in various instances. If Chris is bitten during the first encounter with Yawn the Snake, she can provide you with the anti-venom. If you're struggling with the chemicals puzzle in the residence, she will assist in providing the correct mixture to help defeat the monstrous Plant 42. Furthermore, she's also a necessary assistance for the piano puzzle, seen here, as unlike Jill, who is able to play the sequence without any assistance, Chris is not musically inclined and so needs Rebecca to help him out. Granted, she has to practice for a while, but there's something oddly cathartic about wandering around the mansion listening to her practicing Moonlight Sonata. It cuts through the atmosphere with a sincere reminder that you are not alone. Barry, on the other hand, is much more of a lifesaver. It is entirely possible to avoid the Plant 42 boss fight altogether, as Barry will barge in with a flamethrower if you run in unprepared and destroy the beast for you without much effort. He will also free Jill from this trap, making it much easier to get the shotgun straight away in her campaign. Plus he comes out with this gem, although it's a lot less hilarious in the remake.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really? Thanks.
As far as background characters go in this game, it's true that the spotlight definitely shines on our protagonists, and more so on Jill in particular. Jill even had her own game several years before Chris did. Code Veronica notwithstanding, though it hardly counts since you play as Claire for the majority of the game.
My name is Sheva Alama.
Chris Redfield.
You son of a bitch.
But that's not to say that the other characters don't have their charms as well. Aside from the early deaths of Joseph Frost and Kenneth, who somehow manages to miss a slowly ambling zombie with a shotgun, and Forrest, the rest of the characters have at least enough screen time for the player to understand their motivations and fears. Brad Vickers, the team's pilot, is clearly set up to be a bit of a coward from the off, though as the game progresses he thankfully grows a spine and proves to be the final nail in the tyrant's coffin. Good old Richard and his terrible demons is memorable not just for his very 90s boyband haircut, but for his brash actions and ultimate semi-sacrifice in the Neptune tank if you played as Chris, where the madness of the mansion worms into his mind as bloody great big sharks worm into his guts, or his actual sacrifice in Jill's campaign, where he lovingly leaves you with the parting gift of a tactical shotgun. Enrico, who is probably the most forgettable side character, is located about 2/3 of the way through the game, where he begins to exposit some much needed dialogue before being very rudely disposed of. Of the entirety of the cast, disregarding Wesker for a moment, the focus is very much on Chris and Jill and the destruction that unfolds around them. Each preventable death doesn't really faze them or impact them at all, though it's easy to attribute their glum reactions to their professionalism. Soldiers die, after all, and it wouldn't do to have a STARS member who can't handle their emotions. Still, it would have been nice to see a little more emotion from the characters, particularly the somewhat lifeless Chris, who is well acted for the most part, but has little to work with in comparison to the dynamic between Jill and Barry. You don't really get a sense of history between Rebecca and Chris like you do with Jill and Barry, although to be perfectly honest that's understandable given that Rebecca is 18 years old. Wesker, though, is a godsend. In fact, Wesker is the bright light in any of the games that he appears in, and in fact he is the only reason why I can watch the films as well. Never one to be bland or cheerless, he steals the spotlight every time he appears, whether it be to gleefully announce that the tyrant is beautiful, or to throw his glasses at Chris and beat the living bejesus out of him. In this first instalment, Wesker is considerably toned down in comparison to what he would become as the series steadily began to derail itself, but he's nonetheless a guilty pleasure. As Wesker's madness begins to seep through and his facade breaks down, it not only elevates the tension and compounds upon the already horrifying nature of the tyrant, but teases the player with the possibility of having to fight their own power-hungry boss, only to appease your thirst for blood by ramming a bloody great big claw through his chest. As daft as it is to say so, the Resident Evil Remake is easily the most grounded of all the games. With a realistic background founded in militaristic protocol and a setting so fanatically rendered with supreme attention to detail, Resident Evil is easily the most enjoyable game as far as substance and consistency is concerned. Yes, there are some monsters in this game that are, let's call them bizarre and be kind, and it's hardly realistic to imagine that this could be the result of mutating a frog, but hey, you take the rough with the smooth and there's a considerable amount more of the latter than there is of the former. When divorced from its overall and increasingly silly narrative, the original Resident Evil has a fairly simple story. Investigate some grisly deaths, and try not to die at the hands of the mansion's beasts, uncover the truth, and ultimately destroy the mansion. With the exception of Nemesis, it's probably the simplest story of the entire franchise. Since there's none of the ridiculous, over-the-top fluff from the later entries, the relative lack of narrative interruptions allows the rest of the game to shine in its own uniquely bleak way. Whilst it's true that from time to time a cutscene will happen, either to prompt you in the right direction or give you a little reprieve from the zombified denizens to have a bit of a character interaction instead, the game never inundates you with them and they seem more serviceable than actually necessary. The story really isn't the point of Resident Evil, so the thin narrative covering that the game has neither adds nor detracts from it. In all honesty, I feel a much more complex narrative would have hindered the game, since its focus is much more on solving puzzles, exploring, and shooting things. Capcom certainly understood their priorities in creating this game, both in the original and in the remake, and the talent shines through brilliantly. Even so, it's important to note that the story is hardly inspiring. It's a cautionary tale of corporate greed and evil pharmaceutical companies, kind of. It's not exactly narratively stimulating, but it serves the game in the manner that it needs to. Keep the player engaged with the game, and more importantly, keep the player moving. If you delve into this game expecting an incredible edge-of-the-seat thrill ride, you're playing it for the wrong reasons. Horror often thrives on the simplest of premises, and in that regard, Resident Evil earns a gold star. Boiled down to brass tacks, Resident Evil is a third-person action survival game, where the most complex that the mechanics get are in pairing herbs or examining items to find another item hidden within it. The latter is something you'll be doing a fair amount, whether it's to complete a puzzle to unlock a jewellery box, for example, or to locate a facsimile key within a dog collar. The gameplay is simple, but much like the story, that's all it really needs to be. It serves the game perfectly well. You aim, you pull the trigger. If you aim just right with the shotgun, you have a chance of pulling off an explosive headshot, and so on and so forth. The game makes liberal use of the X button, or your local equivalent, and whilst I did mention earlier that the game pushes you to memorise the mansion layout and limit the time spent in the menus, this doesn't and can't really apply to the majority of the puzzle-based gameplay. A lot of time will be spent in your inventory screen, combining items, examining items, stacking ammo, or exchanging things between the storage boxes in the save rooms. Thankfully, items can be picked up from any item box, although there is an unlockable mode that limits the player so that they can only pick up items from the box that they originally stored them in. If you're up for an interesting memory challenge, this is definitely the way to go. I can imagine how this could become tedious for players, particularly if you're not sure what you're doing or what you're looking for, but once you learn the ins and outs of how the game is going to progress, the dog whistle and the facsimile key being an early example of the game actively teaching you that not everything is as it initially appears, you should find that any apparent tedium will be quashed well before it becomes a problem. It's best to remember that early Resident Evil games were heavily puzzle-based, and whilst they weren't exactly difficult puzzles, they still expect a degree of intuition from the players that is largely informed by how much time you spend poking and prodding things. one of the biggest differences between versions of Resident Evil is actually the base movement speed. In every mainline Resident Evil game released between 96 and 2010, the game's default speed was walking, with a dedicated jog button that, if you were impatient like me, would almost always be enabled. There's not really any need for stealth in the game. The monsters will see you whether you're walking or running, so in general there's no real need to be creeping about the place constantly. However, with the advent of the HD remaster, the base movement speed was changed so that speed is now based on the much more sensible tilt of the analog stick. Now, I say that this is more sensible, but when I think back to it, it's easy to take the original movement speed for granted. I'm not saying that having to keep a button constantly depressed is a better alternative, but the low speed suited the slow, methodical, and investigative nature of the game. Resident Evil is all about the atmosphere. Running laps around the mansion feels like it defeats the purpose of the tight corridors and dark halls somewhat. This isn't necessarily a criticism per se, it's just some food for thought. As a side note, after completing the script, I went back to the GameCube version of the game just to give it a quick test and get some footage from it for the video, and part of me feels like taking back everything I just said because I'd forgotten how heavy-handed the controls actually are. And I spent an awful lot of time running into things by accident. Regardless, the game plays exactly how you would expect it to, with a believable wait and kick to each gun, a brief pause between pressing the aim button and the character actually raising their gun, and depending on the difficulty, a sincere commitment to the survival nature of its horror. It is very easy to fall victim to hubris, assuming that the mansion will still be safe when you return from the residence, for example, or forgetting that that one particular doorknob is broken right when you need it most. The game rewards patience, exploration, and forethought, more so if you know exactly where you're going. Once you play through once or twice, the game is fairly easy to speedrun, and stacking up over 100 bullets in the first 20 minutes or so is entirely reasonable when you're accustomed to the zombies' movement patterns and don't need to waste your bullets. I would say that the game's biggest challenge is definitely its final boss fight. The Tyrant is not especially difficult, but he's also not a pushover, and depending on your actions up to this point, it is entirely possible to wind up fighting him alone. If you've not been particularly frugal with your ammo either, you may have a bit of a field day on your hands. The Tyrant is fast and incredibly strong. He can kill Jill in 2 hits even on normal difficulty. And though your NPC companions can distract him, he can prove a tad frustrating to take down when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the fight. Being the superior creature that he is, the Tyrant has the ability to knock rockets out of mid-air somehow, meaning you ideally need to have his back to you before you fire. One rocket will polish him off, but as long as you remembered to set the self-destruct sequence, or it was done for you, you will have a time limit of 3 minutes to finish off this behemoth as well. It isn't especially difficult, but depending on your level of patience, you may find this fight a little tedious with the constant ducking and weaving you'll need to perform. The Tyrant is the only boss fight in the game that I would say is any real challenge. Enemies like the giant spider or the giant snake are neither especially inspired or much of a skill test. They're more like tests of your nature to see how frugal you've been with your ammo up until this point, though even on the highest difficulty most bosses will go down with just a few short bursts from the grenade launcher or the magnum. The bosses feel less like actual challenges and more like quick diversions to break up the slow and steady gameplay, to prevent it from feeling too tedious, and in that regard, they're functional. The only boss I would say is actually interesting is Lisa Trevor, whom you can either try to shoot to death and waste an awful lot of ammo in the process, or push these 4 chain stones off the edge of the platform. Doing so will open the nearby coffin and reveal Lisa's mother's skeleton, whereupon Lisa will take the skull and jump to her death. This is a very cool fight that doesn't hinge on your ability to spam the shoot button, but rather your attention to environmental detail, and it's not necessarily any easier for it since Lisa can and will knock you off the ledge if you let her get too close. Overall, the gameplay is exactly what it needs to be. Not needlessly complex, but also not so threadbare as to be bland. It paved the way for many horror games that followed it, and whilst the formula has certainly been improved upon, both within and outside of the series, the one thing you'll find most modern survival horror games have taken away from Resident Evil is that the atmosphere is key to the experience. The sad reality is that whilst many horror games know how to make the player jump or shriek, they don't know how to unsettle you. True horror lies not in the next thing to leap out of the shadows at you, but in that slow, creeping dread, the feeling of anxiety as you round every corner, the uncertainty if the movement that you just saw out of the corner of your eye was real or just your imagination, hearing the groans of corpses and their shuffling footsteps but being unable to see the culprit, hearing the clink of chains and the ghastly wails of a hideously deformed child who so desperately wants her mother back, seeing a zombie you thought you killed suddenly rise again, stronger and more brutal than ever before. The Resident Evil series has certainly had its ups and downs. As time went on and the games industry began to scream for more and more innovation, Code Veronica X and Resident Evil 0 were the last dying gasps of a series that desperately needed to reinvent itself. It's a shame that the series ultimately lost its identity, mired in shallow storytelling, rehashes of previous games, and a desperate need to stay relevant in an era exemplified by The Last of Us, BioShock, Modern Warfare. As the popularity of over-the-top shooters dramatically increased, Capcom's vision of its own beloved franchise decreased exponentially. Resident Evil 4 is a great game. It is one of only a small handful of games that I have ever completed more than 5 times. Its innovations for the time, not just for the series but for gaming in general, brought about the dawn of a new era for the survival horror series. But it also brought about its demise. With Resident Evil 5 awkwardly aping its predecessor with none of the flair, and Resident Evil 6 devolving into a twisted mess of a much too tangled spiderweb narrative and frankly ridiculous gameplay, it is inarguable that the 4th game set the stage for the desperation and determination with which the series spent the succeeding decades scrambling. The Resident Evil remake is a window into a time when Capcom not only had the guts to do what they wanted, but the means and the talent to make it happen. They took an enjoyable but extremely silly game and transformed it into a masterclass of subtlety and survival. It's clear that Capcom didn't care whether people bought the remake. They didn't care if people weren't interested in true survival horror. They made the game they wanted to make without the pressure of the masses upon their shoulders, and released it on a console where they must have known it would have a small audience to begin with. The remake stands as a testament to integrity and philosophy over jaded corporate greed, and I can only hope that they remember this when the Resident Evil 2 remake reaches us next year.
Catherine? Please don't leave me alone. Catherine? Catherine?